Hello everybody, I am back from my week hiatus. Sometimes you're just real tired and you just gotta take a week off from absolutely everything. Now I'm back, and if you haven't seen me, I guess welcome. Hello. Nice to have you. Today I would like to talk about adaptation. Now, adaptation is one of the coolest things ever, in my opinion. I think it's so interesting how people can adapt things from a book to a movie, back into a book, into a musical that gets turned into a different movie, which then gets turned into like a TV show. And that TV show becomes a podcast. I don't know. It usually doesn't go that deep, but it is really interesting. However, you may have noticed that it tends to be that things don't get adapted into the same format that they were beforehand. So, for example, the live action Lion King isn't an adaptation, it's a remake. And people like the original, so why are you remaking it, right? It's not an adaptation, adapting it into live action. And it's not live action, it's CGI. Adapting it into live action isn't actually an adaptation, it's a remake because it's in the same style, I guess. I'm not actually sure. I have two books about adaptation. This one's about adaptation and appropriation, and I've only read a little bit of both of them, but I'm working on a project currently about adaptation. I'll tell you that about that a little bit later, but I have a lot to learn about adaptation. In this video, I can't tell you too much about the differences between adaptation and appropriation, and if it's based on, or if it's inspired by, or if it's a remake, but I'm going to try to touch on those topics. However, I would like to talk about some of the most interesting adaptations that I can think of and that I understand. I'd like to start with Hairspray. So Hairspray was initially a movie, and it released in 1988. Now, this here was a regular movie as far as I'm aware. I haven't watched the movie, and maybe I should before talking about it, but as far as I'm aware, it was not a musical whatsoever, and the only music that, was really in it was in the Corny Collins show. That was then adapted into a musical, and that musical was then once again adapted for a film. The ending of the musical and the ending of the movie are rather different. The musical ends more like how you'd expect it to end, with Tracy winning, while the movie has little Inez win. Inez? It's been a while. And that's different. It has Penny's mom at the end. Her reaction is different, whether she accepts Penny or she's still stuck in her ways. These differences are important. I also know that Little Shop of Horrors follows a similar pathway. I believe the initial movie was from the 30s, and then that got adapted into the musical, and then that got adapted into the movie musical. And I know that once again, the movie musical and the musical have different endings, and I think the first movie also has a different ending. I'd have to talk to my friend about that. I learned this over dinner last week, so I thought that was pretty cool. If we're still talking about musicals, which, I mean, I feel passionately about that, I would like to talk about Mean Girls. I mean, ever since I did my 2 Mean Girls videos, I did do some research, and by research I mean I watched the musical. I found a good version with good audio, and it was incredible. I really liked it, and maybe that's just because I was really into the movies lately, and I was just fascinated. I've always been fascinated by Mean Girls, but it's been worse lately. And despite the fact that the music isn't the best in the world, it is still worth a watch, and there's a reason it was on Broadway, That is a musical that, is a movie, which they say in the credits that it's based on the book, Queen Bees, and I don't know the title of the book, but I looked up the book at some point, and the book is basically oh, if your child is feeling weird about high school, it was a guide to being a teenager and cliques in high school or something like that. And I'm gonna be honest here, I don't think that's a based on thing. I would say that that's inspired by, which I'll get back to later about that. And I think later on they might have changed it in the 2024 Mean Girls movie, how they credited that book, but I honestly think that if it's so far removed, yes, giving it credit is good, but I wouldn't say that it's based on, because it is really inspired by. All that being said, movie is inspired by book. And this movie gets turned into a musical, and this musical gets turned into a movie. However, it's not like that. It is not that linear. While the first bit is true, and it's a movie that's inspired by a book that gets turned into a musical, the movie musical is not just based on the musical or the movie. It's a combination of both, which is why fans of both were incredibly disappointed by it. So, like, it's good in and of itself, but because it's an adaptation and a remake at the same time, people just didn't enjoy it. It could have been like Little Shop of Horrors or Hairspray, but it's not quite, because while, of course, I wasn't alive during... Well, actually, I was alive, but I wasn't like actively watching movies or like having opinions on things when Hairspray, the movie musical, came out, and I wasn't alive when Little Shop of Horrors movie musical came out. I don't actually know how the people who were fans of the initial movies or of the musicals felt about it. However, I do know how fans of both the musical and the movie felt about the movie musical. So I think that that's really interesting, because it is both a remake, because they are taking a lot of inspiration from the original movie, but it's also an adaptation because it's adapting the musical. I think that that is so cool, and I'd honestly make an entire separate video about that, but I don't have it in me at the moment. Another adaptation I'd like to talk about, but this I consider a questionable adaptation, and that is Pachinko. So Pachinko is this book. It is massive, okay? It's a multi-generational book. It tells the story of a Korean family who immigrated to Japan, and it starts in like 1910-ish, and it ends in like the 1980s. So it covers a massive period of time, and there are parts of the story that are very detailed and years that go by very slowly. And then there are chapters that are like, this chapter covers the next 7 years. So there's a lot going on in that book. Apple TV got licensed to create a TV show based off of that, but they only had like 6 episodes, and they didn't know if they could have another season, because a lot of the times it's just like that. So they had to pick and choose what they wanted to adapt. Now, this isn't the problem. My problem is that they didn't adapt it. So it feels a lot more like it's based on or inspired by than directly adapted. Because if you adapt something, you are taking one format and you are changing it into another format, but you're telling the same story. And while Pachinko the TV show tells a similar story, it's not quite the same story, and they change a lot. They change a lot of characterization, they change a lot of like personalities, they add and take away so many storylines that you think, is this the same story? Or did you take a story and like deviate from it because you thought you could write it better? So I think that they definitely could have done a based on and just renamed the characters and been like, hey, yeah, it starts in a similar place, it's a similar idea, but it is still different. And then that would have given them a lot more creative liberty, and somebody like me or my mom who watched the TV show after they read the book wouldn't be as disappointed with what was created, because it would have met expectations by simply being inspired by or based on. This way they also could have changed the name, changed the feel, changed the fact that like Isak is actually part of the independence movement. Like, that was not part of the book, but that was in the TV show. That is an example of something that I think shouldn't be considered an adaptation, because they just kind of ignored a lot of what was going on there. And yes, part of adaptation is ignoring something. But that doesn't mean that that's the only thing you should be doing. Let's take the Dead Poets Society book, for example. Most movie and book combos, the book comes first, right? Most people know this. However, Dead Poets Society, the book, was based off of the movie, and a lot of movie fans aren't huge fans of the book. I have not read the book. However, my friend, who is a huge fan, has, or at least she's read enough that she can tell me bits and pieces of it. And the book follows the movie's story pretty faithfully and then adds in some extra scenes and details with the characters and such. This here is an adaptation. It might not be well written, and it might add things or take things away, but it's still an adaptation because it's still faithful to the base story that these characters have, and the arc is still the same. Plus, it is in a different medium than the original, taking one medium, adapting it into another. At least that's my understanding of adaptation. Another example of adaptations changing things but still remaining faithful to the story would be Heathers. While the musical isn't a perfect adaptation, it does take the source material and it does still follow that same arc, but they change things, like Heather Duke's entire personality, or how mean Heather McNamara is, or how relevant Heather Duke is throughout the story, or how much time is focused on the line, "I love my dead gay son." Yes, it's different, but it's still similar enough that it's clearly an adaptation, and even if you changed all the names, you'd be like, that's Heather's. I mentioned that I'm working on a project currently that has to do with adaptation. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to adapt Pachinko into a children's book. This is for a class project, and it's going to be hard because Pachinko is a book that deals with a lot of mature themes, and it goes through so much time, and it's so complex. So a children's book that has no complexity to it and has to follow a single storyline, and I mean, what am I going to write about people dying of tuberculosis and like being imprisoned and the war and like sex before marriage and then marrying a guy that is not the father of your baby? Like, how can you put that in a children's book, right? So I'm not sure if what I'm actually making is an adaptation. I would say that it's inspired by or based on, but it's not a direct adaptation because some things are much harder to adapt than others. While they're both the same media type, a picture book and a novel are very different, and I acknowledge that. However, it's still a little bit difficult to figure out what you're doing with this, if it's truly an adaptation, and how can adaptations and inspirations and based-ons be removed and changed from each other. Another example of adaptation is when artists take novels and they make comic versions of them. Like, for example, graphic novel versions of Percy Jackson, or I don't know, that's kind of the only example I've got. But something like that. I mean, I don't know if it exists, but like, let's say graphic novel Hunger Games, Graphic novel 50 Shades of Grey. I've never read 50 Shades of Grey, but I just think that would be a funny thing to say. Anyway, adaptation is something that I think it's so cool and it's so interesting, and I'm not against it. However, I do want people to, like, create a little bit more interesting things. I feel like every other movie that comes out, it's like, it's an adaptation. It's based on this. Actually based on that is fine. I don't see that many of those. But it's like, this is an adaptation. And it's like, cool. I don't mind adaptations. I'm glad that Dune is out there, But then it's like, it's a prequel. It's a sequel. It is a remake. And I'm like, I would like something original out there in the world. The Minecraft movie is an adaptation. Fun fact, they're adapting a video game into a movie. A storyless video game into a movie. There is no plot in Minecraft, and they made a movie out of it. I think that's an adaptation. I don't know. I feel like I've lost the thread on this one just a wee bit, but huge fan of adaptations and would love to learn more about them. I think that's about all I've got today. I could have probably made a better video about this, but I wanted to put out a video this week, and adaptation is something that's been on my mind, and I've wanted to make this for some time now. So, thank you so much for watching me scramble and loop my way through my thoughts on adaptation, which I'm not even sure if they're going to make sense, but I guess I'll find out when I edit the video. Thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye for now.